Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. A powerful story, appropriate for this Labor Day weekend, where we celebrate workers. Now, for as long as the Christian faith has been in existence, there's been a tension between righteousness that comes to us as a free gift and righteousness that is earned. Some may have heard it called works faith versus grace. Now, the first kind, well, grace we know, because if you know the definition, you know that grace is unmerited favor of God. That was drilled into me by my Sunday school teachers growing up. Unmerited favor of God. And the Bible says that God is never ceasing in his mercy extended to us. He has loved us with an everlasting love. God's grace, freely given, lavishly bestowed upon us, is what makes us the crown of his creation. We have worth and value because we are made in the image and likeness of God. Grace says you are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. And it's not necessary to achieve saltiness or lightness. It's already in our DNA because of grace. Grace sometimes doesn't look like what we might think it looks like. Remember the story of the Pharisee praying so loudly and colorfully in front of everybody? And then the tax collector who prays so humbly. By all appearances, it was the Pharisee who should have been accorded recognition, but Jesus noticed the prayer of the tax collector. Grace, that's what that is. Remember the younger son, the prodigal son who left home and blew his father's wealth and came back home, and the older brother got jealous. By all appearances, the older brother should have been accorded a pat on the back for being good and trustworthy and rewarded for his loyalty, but it was the prodigal who got shoes for his feet, a ring for his finger, and the fatted calf feast. That's grace. Here's the truth. If not, it's not grace if you have to work for it. Hear me again. I'm going to say it again. It's not grace if you have to work for it. I think I heard a horn on that one. It's only grace when it comes unsolicited and unmerited. It's what makes us Christians, is grace. Now then there's the other kind of righteousness that's earned, and we call that works. No grace in it. It's rarely gracious. Because when you think in terms of works, you're thinking about tally marks. If I do this well, or if I'm a good person, I'll get enough tally marks. And then when I come to the end of my days, and I'm facing the Lord, he'll have mercy on me. No grace there, only work. I want to read this journalist who wrote an autobiography called The Good Times. His name's Russell Baker, and he described an example of works. My mother, dead now to this world, but still roaming free in my mind, wakes me some mornings before daybreak, saying, if there's one thing I can't stand, it's a quitter. I've heard her say that all my life. Now lying in bed, coming awake in the dark, I feel the fury of her energy fighting the good-for-nothing idler within me who wants to go back to sleep instead of tackling the brave new day. She's hounded me with these same battle cries since I was a boy in short pants back in the Depression. Amount to something. Make something of yourself. Don't be a quitter. On bad mornings in the darkness, suspended between dreams and daybreak, with my mother racketing around in my head, I feel crushed by failure. I am a fool to think I amount to anything. A man doesn't amount to something because he has been successful at a third-rate career like journalism. This is stinking thinking that's going through his head right now. It is evidence, that's all. Evidence that if he buckled down and worked hard, he might someday do something really worth doing. That is an extreme works mindset. And this person is never going to be good enough in the mind of his mother. There's no joy in works righteousness. It's simply a matter of accounting. Over in the left-hand column are all my good deeds, good thoughts, good words, good intentions. And over in the right-hand column are all my bad deeds, bad thoughts, bad words, missed opportunities. You line them up side by side, and you see which one has the most. If there's more on the righteous side, then I'm good. But if there's more on the bad side, I'm sunk. And given the human bent to sinning, we're all sunk. This is what works righteousness is called. And the Bible condemns it from cover to cover. But almost all of us have, or are now, its victims. And Jesus spent the better part of his ministry trying to help followers move away from a life pattern of works righteousness and toward a life pattern of grace. And he did it by telling us stories of grace, like the one I read today. What's God's grace like? Look at the story. How is God's grace extended to humanity? What should our response be? At first reading, it seemed puzzling and disconcerting about a farm manager who goes into a village to enlist laborers to gather his crop. And he gets some of them first thing in the morning and offers to pay them a fair day's wage. And later in the morning, he signs up another group, and still later in the middle of the afternoon, he recruits some more. And then 1 hour before quitting, he recruits some more. Nobody quibbles about this apparent idiosyncrasy until it's time to settle the accounts. Now, you need to know that Jewish law mandated that the payment had to be to day laborers. It had to be at the end of the day, because Deuteronomy 24:15 says, each day before sunset, pay him for that day's work. He needs the money and has counted on getting it. These weren't wealthy people. They needed the money. And Jesus probably told this story in the late summer, about the time of the grape harvest. Grapes are usually in their peak in August and September. And then by the middle of September, the rains came and there was a race to get all the grapes gathered. So calling in extra laborers at all hours of the day is not far-fetched as it might first appear. But the problem is, as I said a moment ago, when it came time to settle up at the end of the day, the group that signed up at 5 o'clock and worked 1 hour got exactly the same pay as those who had been picking grapes all the day in the hot sun. That's not fair. And those all-day workers chafed. Unfair, they said. We've been working since early this morning and you're not paying us any more than you're paying those who haven't even broken a sweat. To which the farm manager gave what sounds to us like a curious response. Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I want to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I want with my own things? Or do you begrudge my generosity? It's a little bit different translation. Now, the Bible's not an economic textbook. It's not an accounting tutorial. It's not a line item guide on how to be a business person. It's stories. Stories that Jesus told to drive home a point. And the point of this story is that God is so good that he pours out his blessings on us, not because we merit them, but because he loves to demonstrate his goodness. Not because of something we've done, because we are his children. Amen. And what is this? Grace. This isn't about wage and hours and labor relations. It's about the extravagant goodness of God. This causes me to think about the thief on the cross beside Jesus. He gets just as much heaven and paradise at that last moment, that bedside confession, as a person who spent their whole life following Christ because of grace. George Buttrick wrote, "The parable does not mean that the kingdom is a realm of complete equity or that God's good fortune is bestowed at the expense of a faithful labor, or the God verdicts are arbitrary. No, this parable is one little piece of a much fuller and richer biblical presentation of the grace of God." Grace of God does not make sense. Love your enemies doesn't make sense. Care for the lost, last, lonely, least doesn't make sense. Jesus responded with the parable of the farm manager and the day laborers, the point of which is that no matter what your lot in life, God's mercy, God's grace is sufficient for you where you are, what you need on that day. And we cannot look at another's grace through jealous eyes. We cannot compare my grace with your grace. The laborers who'd worked the full day received wages they had been promised when they began work. But because they were feeling envious of those who got the same things for less, they couldn't be happy for their own grace. Sometimes we feel sorry for ourselves, thinking that, well, I've had it more rough than that person. Once in a while, we court the notice that somebody else is a greater recipient of God's favor than we are. But you see, we don't see through God's eyes. We don't know what's going on in the personal heart and home and head of every individual. It's impossible to know what difficulties plague the other person. And behind that smiling facade may lurk problems and pain beyond your imagination. You cannot compare your grace with somebody else's grace. The proper response to life is gratitude, always. The proper response to grace is gratitude. Be thankful to God for what has been given to you, and pray that God will be as lavish toward others who may be facing hidden trials of which we have no knowledge. Now, this is not prosperity doctrine, that if I do what God says, he's going to pour out heaps of wealth on me. That's not the promise. The promise is grace, and what we need comes just in time, just enough, and it may not be a Bentley or a BMW or in the form of monetary, but it will be what you need, and it will be extravagant grace. So, I exhort you, don't compare your grace to your neighbor's. His grace is sufficient for you. How many times have you thought that? Well, in this circumstance, his grace is sufficient for you is about what you need and not comparing it with somebody else. Grace isn't free if you have to work for it. There's nothing we can ever do to earn it. Now, let me just say this. We believe that if you confess Christ, you are a recipient of the gift of grace, and that gift is not something that can ever be taken away. It's a gift. If there is nothing that you can do to earn this grace, then there's nothing you can do to keep this grace. It's grace. So if you live a life worrying about, if I mess up, I'm going to go to hell, I want you to have freedom today, because if you truly have God's grace, that gift won't be taken from you because there's nothing you can do to keep it. You can't be good enough. Nobody can. Let gratitude rule your heart, not fear or envy or legalism. God has no part of these things. What we can learn from these stories that Jesus told. The parable of the workers. One of my friends has a saying, just stay in your lane. You ever heard that? Stay in your lane. That means do what you're supposed to do. Receive your grace sufficient for you. Not looking around and comparing or being jealous or envious, but staying in your lane. Boy, is that good advice. As you experience the extravagant grace of God today and this week, may you remember that you are loved beyond measure, and that God's grace is sufficient for every day and every moment. Will you pray with me as Eva comes?